setting off the bomb. Who hired Mike Campbell to kill Mr. Olander? The intended victim was unharmed by the explosion. It came to light that the Olanders were feuding with their next-door neighbors, the Vosses, over each neighbor constantly parking in each other's parking spot. In the middle of the night, each one would take turns getting in their cars and slowly driving their car up behind the other one's car and pushing the other one's car right in front of the fire hydrant that's on that block. So they would get lots of nice citations and fines from the city cops. Another theory is that the Olander family was having their own family feud. Mr. Olander's sister accused him of hiding assets of their late mother from the rest of the family. Olander's death would revert all the mother's assets to his sister. No motive for this crime was found. Probably the second most famous crime to occur in Edgewater happened in 1957. On the night of August 16, 1957, a young 15-year-old girl named Judith Anderson left the apartment of her girlfriend after an evening of television watching to return to her home in the Chicago suburb of Austin. Judith right there. She was never seen again. 6 days later, fishermen in Montrose Harbor discovered an old motor oil drum floating in the water. They hauled it ashore and were horrified at its contents. The headless torso and limbs of a young woman had been stuffed inside. Another smaller container was discovered in the near vicinity 2 days later that contained a severed head and limbs of a young woman. Police identified all the remains to be those of Judith Anderson. One of the largest murder investigations in Chicago history commenced, which resulted in the interrogation of thousands of witnesses and hundreds of suspects. The murder case gained national attention and grabbed sensationalized headlines for newspapers and across the country. Eventually, local authorities announced the prime suspect of the killing to be a 24-year-old construction worker named Barry Xander Cook, right here, of Chicago's North Side. Cook, who lived with his parents, was a suspect in a previous sexual assault on a woman at a downtown Chicago beach. Barry Xander Cook already had the reputation of being a serial rapist. Witness identified Cook as the man seen driving a car to the waterfront at Montrose Harbor and disposing a large object into the water on the night of Anderson's disappearance. Police arrested Cook near a construction site on the 1600 block of Kenmore Avenue. During his murder trial in the late spring of 1958, it was revealed that Cook picked up Anderson while she was walking home, shot her in the head in his car, drove her body to the house of his parents, who were out of town for the weekend, near Hermitage and Highland in Edgewater. There, he dismembered her body in a workroom in the basement and sealed the parts in containers found in the alley. Barry Xander Cook was convicted by a jury and sentenced to a 14-year prison term. He was released, however, in 1967. The first crime actually began in the late 1950s, but was exposed in 1960. In 1960, the local newspapers exposed a scandal involving dirty Chicago cops. From 1958 to 59, 8 police officers, all here, from the Summerdale Police District in Edgewater, here it is here, took part in a large-scale burglary ring. Uniformed officers stole property from businesses while on duty and then kept it or sold it for cash. As a direct result, underwriters refused to insure local merchants. The accused cops did not like to get their own hands dirty, so they employed the talents of a young cat burglar named Richard Morrison, seen here, to do the dirty work of their scheme. When Morrison was eventually caught and suspected by federal agents as being in cahoots with the 8 Summerdale officers, the hapless thief was nicknamed the babbling burglar by the accused officers themselves due to his habit of singing like a bird under the pressure of questioning. Richard Morrison implicated all the dirty cops, giving the FBI an open and shut case. The 8 Summerdale officers were fined and fired and convicted. The Chicago public were outraged At the time, this was the worst police corruption scandal in Chicago history. Mayor Richard J. Daley vowed to make reforms, so he brought in Orlando W. Wilson, seen up here, UCLA professor criminologist, to head a special committee on police reform. Mayor Daley eventually appointed O.W. Wilson himself to be the new police reform superintendent. Mr. Wilson held this post from 1962 to 67 and is credited for implementing plans to modernize the Chicago police force, rooting out corruption, and improving relations between police officers and Chicago's general citizens. Police Commissioner Tim O'Connor was forced to resign as a result of this scandal. The old Summerdale Police District at 1900 block of Foster Avenue was renamed Foster Avenue Station, and it closed in 2003. Edgewater is currently served by the Lincoln Police District and the Rogers Park Police District. Richard Morrison left Illinois after the trials ended in 1962 and moved to Florida. A local theater company has recently purchased the old Summerdale Police Station and planned to renovate it as a performing arts theater. And the other crime that occurred in 1960 was the apprehension of Chicago's mob boss at the time. Fiore Fifi Buccieri, the self-proclaimed mob boss of Chicago during the 1960s, was invited to attend a party in his honor that was hosted by 200 of his closest gangster pals in the Windy City. The fete was to take place in the fashionable Edgewater room, seen here, of the grand old Edgewater Beach Hotel. On March 25th, 1967, everyone dined and drank as they honored Fifi, the mob boss, and his many successes. Unbeknownst to the reveling hoods, the waitstaff for the party happened to be made up entirely of federal agents. Law enforcement officials were tipped off weeks in advance of the intended gangster convention at the famous hotel, and all were arrested. Fifi was convicted in 1970. Mayor Richard Daley ordered an investigation of the owners of the hotel, their partners, and the hotel's business practices. And therefore, as a result, the Edgewater Beach Hotel closed in December 1967. Buccieri died in prison in 1973. The entertainment that evening at the hotel was Minsky's Follies, a racy revue. Chicago has a well-earned reputation for political crime and corruption, with scores of politicians going to jail in just the past few decades. Edgewater, however, has enjoyed several recent decades represented by public officials who have either been in the reform, good government, or independent wings of politics, and or came from community roots with ties to local crime-fighting efforts and ethics. But all has not been perfect, as we saw two public officials convicted of self-serving misconduct, one in the 1970s and one in the 1980s. Both were convicted of taking or soliciting bribes in land deals right in their own neighborhoods, thus working against the better interests of their constituents. Both came up through traditional political ranks. First one was Paul Wagoda, the alderman of the 49th Ward, of accepting a $50,000 bribe regarding the newly formed Warren Park, and he was convicted and went to prison. And next is probably the most bizarre crime that happened in Chicago. Teresita Chita Baza, who worked at the old Edgewater Hospital. Edgewater made national news in 1978 when Newsweek covered the unbelievable story of a local murder case. The victim was Teresita Chita Baza, a respiratory therapist at the hospital. On February 21st, 1977, she was stabbed in the chest, laid on her bed, and set on fire. Some money and jewelry were taken from her apartment. 5 months later, another Edgewater employee, physiotherapist Remembios Rimi Chua, began to experience anomalies. She went into trances in the middle of the night, telling her husband Jose she was Baza. She often woke up screaming in the middle of the night, and she sometimes felt ill for no reason. Although they worked in the same place, Vaza and Chua had not really known each other. But Chua began sitting at Vaza's favorite spot in the cafeteria, and according to others at the hospital, began adopting Vaza's mannerisms. As this strange behavior continued, the trances became longer and the voice more insistent. Speaking through Chua, the voice told Jose not to be scared and asked for his help. The voice named Alan Showery, another Edgewater Hospital employee, as Vaza's killer, and described where her jewelry could be found. Jose Chua took this information to the police. The jewelry turned up in a search of Showery's apartment, and under questioning, Alan Showery confessed to the murder. Here is Chita Vaza, and that's the killer, Alan Showery. In 1980 in London, at a famous jewelry store in London, a jewellery heist occurred. Two men dressed as Arabs dashed in and stole all the jewelry out of their storefront display case and dashed right out. They got on a plane and that was headed to Chicago, and when they landed at O'Hare, they were immediately apprehended by the FBI. Their names were Joe Scalise and Art Rachel. Art Rachel, afterwards, they were both convicted and sentenced to prison and were released. And Art Rachel moved into the Edgewater neighborhood. He lived in an apartment on Ardmore Avenue and moved away. But he did live in our neighborhood. The diamond, one of the diamonds that they stole in the heist was the famed Marlborough diamond, which was a family heirloom of the Churchill family on Mrs. Churchill's family side. Her family lineage was the Duke of Marlborough. And she, in fact, wore the diamond in her tiara during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. And Queen Elizabeth is currently celebrating her Diamond Jubilee this year. Last time that happened was Queen Victoria in 1897. They never found the Marlborough diamond, and local legend has it that one of the heists, jewelry heist criminals, either Art Rachel, who lived in Edgewater, or Joe Scalise, hid the diamond by plastering it up in the walls of their apartments. So local legend has it that the Marlborough diamond may be plastered up in an apartment somewhere in Edgewater, though we will never know. Martin Tuchow, who was the Cook County Commissioner and 48th Ward Democratic Committeeman, was accused in 1980 of bribery. As Edgewater worked its way back from the decline of the post-war era and into the 1960s and 70s, its electoral politics had become dominated by traditional machine politicians, although Edgewater had previously produced two good government mayors in the 20th century, who were William Deaver, a Edgewater resident, and Kennelly. Activist homeowners, political activists, and community groups organized to clean up political corruption, revive the housing stock, and advocate for a safer community. Against the backdrop remained a local Democratic Party apparatus known for electoral shenanigans, including election fraud that gained from the manipulated votes coming from substandard slum housing that the local community groups wanted to ameliorate. Transplanted from the notorious Democratic machine on Chicago's West Side, Martin Tuchow, a divorce attorney, became the choice of Mayor Richard J. Daley and took hold of the 40th Ward Democrats, serving from 1970 to 1984. He also won as Cook County Commissioner from 74 to 85, becoming the powerful finance chair. He was eventually indicted in 1983 and convicted in 1984 of extortion for attempting to solicit the exorbitant amount of $5,000 per unit for building permits for a developer of a condominium conversion at the northeast corner of Kenmore Avenue and Berwyn. This was in the very area that the community was trying to revive. He served 3 years of a 6-year federal sentence and now lives in Florida. In 2006, he was interviewed by Chicago Magazine. Said what a wonderful time he had being the Cook County Commissioner. During the 1990s, Edgewater Hospital performed wholesale Medicare fraud. Edgewater Hospital was founded in 1929 by Dr. Morry Matson. For 60 years, the neighborhood hospital was well managed and respected throughout the area. After Mazel's death in 1980 and his wife's death in 1988, the staff sold the hospital to new owners and it was rechristened the Edgewater Medical Center. In 1999, evidence came to light that the new management had been systematically submitting false billings to Medicare that resulted in massive overcharges to the federal government. One doctor claimed to have made 31 house calls in one day during the blizzard of 1993. The same doctor also claimed to have visited 189 patients in one day in 1997, all of whom supposedly had congestive heart failure. Many unnecessary and expensive invasive surgeries were performed, one of which was responsible for killing a patient. The management and staff roamed the streets at night to find homeless people, immigrants, people without health insurance to bring into the hospital to fill empty beds and perform needless medical treatment on them. To compensate the, quote, patients for their cooperation, the staff gave them food, money, or cigarettes. In 2000, the federal government began a full investigation of Edgewater Medical Center for Medicare fraud. News of the fraud filled the local newspapers in 2001, and Medicare officially stopped all its funding to the hospital later that year. Edgewater Medical Center closed its doors as a result in December 2001. In the end, 2 doctors and several members of the hospital management were convicted of fraud and tax evasion and sent to prison for lengthy sentences, and the hospital remains vacant today. One of the famous people to be born at the old Edgewater Hospital was a man named John Wayne Gacy in 1947. He is the notorious 1970s serial killer who was convicted of 33 murders and was sentenced to death and was in fact executed in Illinois in 1994. And our final crime of the exhibit occurred in 2002, involving the killer podiatrist. Dr. Ronald Mikos ran a busy foot surgery practice in Skokie, but according to Medicare, his office was just a little too busy. Mikos claimed to have performed 6,000 surgeries in 1 year. One of his patients, Joyce Brannon, 54-year-old disabled caretaker from Edgewater, noticed discrepancies on her doctor bills and reported them to Medicare. In 2002, the federal government subpoenaed Brannon to testify against Dr. Mikos. Days before the court hearing, the busy foot doctor called Brannon and begged her not to testify.